Hello, so welcome to this, my first ever YouTube video, and what I'm going to try and do in this video is make some 5160 spring steel powder. What I'm going to do is I'm going to mix some powders together. I'm going to throw them in a canister. I'm going to forge weld that into a solid billet and then strip the can off the outside. So 5160 spring steel is a low alloy carbon steel. It is mostly iron, but has percentages of carbon, manganese, chromium and silicon inside it, all of which are quite low percentages, all less than 1%. And what I've got is I've got a few different powders that I bought online for these things. I've started off with 1 kilogram of iron powder, and then I'm going to add the carbon, the manganese, the chromium and the silicon into it and mix that into a powder. This is the iron powder that I bought. It's 99.9% pure, so it's basically as pure as I can get it without trebling the price. I think that was about 10 quid for that kilo, 10 to 13 quid, something like that. So I've got a pair of digital scales here, and I've got a measuring beaker. You can get these from pretty much any vending machine. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to mix the alloying elements in first, make a small amount of powder just out of those, and then I'll pour the iron on top and give it a good shake from there. So here we go. And there we have it. What we've got in the end of that is we've got a small amount of powder in our jar, just an old coffee jar, and I'm going to pour the iron on top of that and shake that up and mix it as well as I can do by hand. There we go. Give that a good shake. Do that off camera. Keep shaking that up. And at the end of it, we're going to mix that up and make as much of an even blend of powder out of it as possible. So I'm going to be using this for various different projects. So I'm going to make a small canister out of this just to test the steel out. So any chemists that are watching this video are probably screaming right now that it doesn't matter how much I shake that powder, it's still never going to be steel. And they're absolutely right. If you imagine this like a ball pool, where the majority of balls are red, that represents the iron, add in a few different coloured other balls to represent the other different alloyed elements. What we're going to do is we're going to provide heat and pressure in order to be able to squish them down and essentially fuse them together into one solid mass, and that mass will be steel. And that's the idea. The more heat and pressure we can apply, the more we're going to be able to munge this, and those atoms are going to be able to have enough energy to be able to munge into one solid piece. So the can that we're using here, I'm just using a piece of box steel. It's about 1mm thick, walls deliberately thin. It's about 40mm wide by about 20mm tall, and I'm going to cut a 60mm length out of that just to make a small billet. I'm going to add an extra 20mm on top of that in order to be able to fold over and kind of make the outside edges of the billet. There we have it. That's our box, not folded over. I'm going to take that, I'm going to stick that in my small press and fold those edges over, and that's it. Those need welding now. Once those are welded, I'll have the beginnings of my box. That's it. Quite ugly, nothing fancy, but it does the job. It's all going to get pulled off the outside anyway. Next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to coat the inside of this. So if you imagine you've got your box and inside that you've got your billet, you want to keep the two things separate. So I'm painting on a mix of titanium dioxide and linseed oil. The linseed oil is just there to make it liquid. If I did it again, I would probably use something like methylated spirits or kerosene that burns off a lot easier. But I paint this off on the inside of this and give it a good coat on the inside. And this forms a protective layer between the steel and the box. Titanium doesn't like to weld to anything, so it's a really nice material for that. So one of the things I forgot to do was make the top part of this to fold over, so I'm going to do that now. And there's my finished box. I've got my jar of steel, I've got my box, and I've got some screws that I've cut the tops off. These are just mild steel screws, and I'm going to throw them in the box just to form a little bit of a spine, make sure this powder can forge well to other materials, and just give it a little bit of a contrast. Right now what I'm going to have to do is I'm going to have to fill this box with powder. I'm going to get it as full as I can. I'm going to keep those screws at the back and make sure that they're all at the back of the box. So there we have it, a nice full box of steel. I'm going to fold the top of that over in the press now. So this is my press. This is simply a 20-ton bottle jack with a couple of steel plates welded at the top and bottom of it. It's more of a vertical vise than anything. So there we have it, nice and folded over at the top as well. The reason why I couldn't just hammer this down is the powder would just go everywhere, so it's good to be able to use something like a press like this to be able to squish that top down nice and cleanly. I'm going to weld that over the top, and then I'm going to throw that in the forge, get the forge nice and hot. So here's my forge, it's running. I've already thrown the billet in there now. So the next thing to do is to get on the anvil, get that box up to forge welding temperature and smack it down and get it into a nice solid block of steel. So what I keep bringing up to the camera here is to show you the billet starting to shine through the box. The box hasn't bonded to the billet, but the billet is now one packed homogeneous block of steel, and so it keeps its heat a lot better than the thin can on the outside, which then goes a dull red, and that's a really good sign. So I'm going to let this thing cool now, and then I'm going to cut the box off the outside and hopefully have a solid billet of steel on the inside of it. See how it goes. That's pretty much it. I mean, this thing is almost wants to fall off right now. Very, very loose. So a couple of taps with the hammer, and there we go. Still relatively warm after being in the forge, but there we have a nice solid billet of steel. I'm quite happy with that. There's a couple of lines in it. That's just from the angle grinder. They're not cracks or anything else like that, so I'm not worried about that. I'm quite happy with that block of steel. We went from a bag of powder into a solid block of steel. In part 2, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take that block of steel, I'm going to see if I can forge that into just a simple utility knife, nothing fancy, and have a look at the kind of steel that's come out of this powder. So, thank you for watching.